Dr. Kerry, and welcome back to the channel.
Yeah, glad to be back on.
Yeah, so today we are going to talk about Acts. And you have a great blog post explaining why Acts is fiction. And I'm going to link it to the description. It's a very complete blog post with all kinds of information about all the relevant things. So maybe we can start. Can you please tell us in a general way, why do you think Acts is fiction as opposed to history?
Yeah, and I'm not alone on this. This is kind of like the mainstream consensus now, is that the author of Acts is writing propaganda and mythography, basically. He's writing an epic story of the origins of Christianity, and he's not really that concerned with historical accuracy. And most of what he's constructing, and this is what we all have noticed, and I gather all the links and scholarship and examples and stuff in that article, which is how we know Acts is a fake history, is that several things. I mean, one is it follows the style of an ancient novel, not the style of an ancient history. So it looks, I mean, it's written in the genre of novels, not in the genre of a history book, even by the standards of that time. And its stories are obviously and demonstrably based on mythology. So like they'll take other literature and retell a story from an ancient book, like, you know, the King's narrative, the Elijah narrative in Kings, the King's literature, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, which is a big model that Luke used, Jubilees, and a variety of other, even like the Bacchae of Euripides. Like he takes all of these models, both Jewish, like he uses the Septuagint a lot, Jewish stuff, and Greek stuff as well, and Roman stuff. And he's taking all of this literature and he's retelling stories based on that material. So it's obviously mythical, like what his construction is that based on that. And we can give some examples later. And also he's reflecting the gospel. So like the author of Acts wrote the gospel. We call him Luke, although we have no reason to believe that was his actual name. But it's just convenient to say Luke because that's what we know. It's sort of the pseudonym for the author. So the Gospel of Luke has a particular storyline, and then a lot of those pieces get recapitulated in Acts. So we have like Paul does all the same things as Jesus, but bigger, right? There's things that happen in Acts that also, like the baptism scene is emulated in the Damascus scene, the conversion scene for Paul. And so there's a lot of, and you can show literary, like there's direct verbal lifts, there's like literary structure similarities and so on. And a lot of like the mythic trickery that we're used to seeing in how mythography got written back then. So you can actually show that this is the case. So he's clearly constructing this narrative this way. The other side of all of this is that he completely rewrites history. We know he gets a lot of color detail from Josephus, but he makes mistakes. He gets things wrong. And we also know that he's aware of the letters of Paul. And I think quite deliberately, he changes that. So like he rewrites the narrative history that, according to Paul, and contradicts Paul on lots of places on purpose, right? So he doesn't like the true story that we get from the eyewitness of Paul. Luke needs to spin a different story, he has a different agenda. And so he rewrites everything. And Luke's agenda is generally to show that both the Jewish and the Gentile wings of the church got along since the beginning. That is not the narrative we have in Paul. It's quite the opposite. And the other thing is that the Christians were always law-abiding citizens, and it's really the mean Jews that are like the enemy. And so the Romans have always treated them nice and should continue to treat them nice, because they can always obey the law, and they're always good people, etc. So those are the two agendas that he wants to tell, and a lot of that requires him to rewrite what's in Paul. And one of the big examples is Paul tells us that he was never in Judea until after his conversion. So no one knew him, and they only knew legends of him from outside Judea when he was originally a persecutor of the church, a harasser of the church. We don't really know what that meant in practice. And then he only, after he converted, did he come to Judea and Jerusalem. The book of Acts has him start already killing Christians or participating or watching people kill Christians in Jerusalem from the beginning, and being given orders by the Jerusalem elite to go leave Judea and pursue Christians elsewhere. and then immediately come back to, like, as soon as he converts, he comes back to Jerusalem, etc. This is absolutely contrary to the narrative that we have in Paul. So, like, for our eyewitness source does not agree with what this sort of tall tales that Acts is telling. Another aspect of this is when Paul says that he was converted, he immediately went to Arabia and evangelized in Arabia, and then came back to Damascus. And it was only years later that he went to Jerusalem. The book of Acts just has him get converted. He goes immediately to Damascus, not to Arabia, in a matter of days. And then in a matter of weeks, he comes back to Jerusalem and never goes to Arabia. And this is kind of particularly weird. Like, why did Acts erase like almost the entire history of Paul there? It's especially weird because in that story, Acts mentions the case of him being ferreted out of Damascus to hide from the authorities in a basket, right? There's a little basket story. We have that from Paul in 2 Corinthians, but he tells a very different story. In Acts, it's the mean Jews who in Damascus who are pursuing Paul. That is not the story in that Paul tells. Paul says that Arabian marshals were hounding the city, waiting for him to come out and get him. Now, we don't know why Arabian marshals, these are not Jews, these are Arabian marshals. We don't know why Arabian marshals are pursuing Paul in Damascus, but the fact that he went and evangelized to Arabia and came back to Damascus suggests he did something in Arabia that got him in trouble and had the Arabian marshals chasing him. And it was the Arabian marshals that he was trying to avoid when he was lowered in the basket. So Acts keeps removing, and that's kind of a hint of Paul breaking the law somehow, right? Like he's did something that pissed off the secular authorities, and he was a wanted fugitive. Well, that's a story that the author of Acts doesn't want. So he's erased it by having it be just the unjust Jews pursuing him for unjust reasons. So he wasn't really. So the enemy is always the Jews. And so that's a good message to the Romans. It's, no, it's always the Jews just making accusations against us that are false. And that's what Acts shows over and over again. The Jews accuse Paul or whoever in court, and the Romans say that's a dumb accusation, go away. And so that's the narrative. So this is basically Luke is trying to make the Romans like Christians by blaming the Jews for everything. And you have the same thing when you have the narrative of the nativity, where Matthew has the entire family of Jesus become fugitives from the law for years on end, whereas Luke undoes that and has them be obedient to the law. They follow the Roman law. They stay in their home. They go back to Jerusalem every year according to Jewish law. So they're law-abiding citizens in Luke, right? So the fact that he changes the nativity of Matthew to take like a fugitive narrative into law-abiding also explains why he's removed the fugitive narrative that Paul tells himself and changes it into a different narrative where Paul is not like a wanted fugitive. And so that's an example. There's a lot of other examples. There's the speech of Gamaliel, who talks about all of these rebel leaders that they are comparing Christianity to falsely. But that's all historically wrong. So like one of them, Theudas, his rebellion is like 15 years later than the speech is depicted. So Gamaliel is somehow referring to an event in the past that hadn't even happened yet and wouldn't for over a decade. And Luke talks about the order, the sequence of these guys, and gets the sequence wrong. And the reason he gets the sequence wrong, we know, is because Josephus does it in that sequence, but one of them is a flashback. And so Luke sort of skimmed this, got the order right, but didn't get the chronological order right. And so he wasn't reading Josephus very carefully. And that is a mistake that only, like, he names the exact same three guys and gets the order exactly the same as in Josephus, but it's chronologically wrong. So Luke misread Josephus. This is a mistake that can only be explained by Luke cribbing Josephus, and quickly. Like, he's not even carefully researching Josephus. He's just looking to grab information out and throw it into his story, and that causes a mistake. And so these are the kinds of clues that we have that where Luke is rewriting history. He's getting things wrong. And then you combine that with the fact that he's using mythic structure. He's inventing narratives. He's following the novella epic narrative style, not the historiographic style in Acts, and so on. So these things are all the things that convince historians now that this is propaganda and it's fiction and mythology. It's not a carefully researched history.
Yeah, thanks. That's great. Yeah, I've heard of that one, the Theudas one, when Luke makes a mistake on the chronology. I think maybe we can talk a little bit about that one. I heard that one is very popular. Maybe you know what I think apologists usually say that maybe there was another Teudas.
Yeah.
That's really, really implausible. Or they
Right.
have
Yeah.
other
Yeah.
excuses. I don't know. Or
Right.
you can also, yeah, you can tell us what are some other mistakes. What are some other mistakes about that? For example, I think another unrealistic thing is where Peter gives a speech and it's like he say like 3,000 people or 5,000 people
Yeah.
converted or something like that. I don't know. That's another
Yeah.
very unrealistic thing. So you can tell
Yeah,
us a bit about
that's
this
worth
example.
pointing out too, is that Acts has a lot of like miraculous events that are not historically plausible, so he's clearly making stuff up. The miraculous conversion of 3,000 people is an obvious example of that. Historians point out that even the way the story is told wouldn't even convince anybody, much less 3,000, because it's done in a style that is Greek, even though it's supposed to be an Aramaic audience. It's a series of arguments that would make no sense to a first century Jewish audience, much less convince them. It wouldn't even be. It's like literally impossible sequence of events. It's not realistic, but it looks great as sort of like glorifying fiction, right? It's a similar kind of hagiographic narrative that we get constantly throughout the Middle Ages, where you have these sort of grandiose things happen, proving how awesome and wonderful the hero is. But they aren't historically believable at all. And so, yeah, there's a lot of that in Acts as well, and that stacks on top of all the other evidence that we just mentioned.
Yeah. So, what's interesting here is that apologists, they usually make the opposite case. They present Acts as evidence that Luke is a great historian.
Yeah.
Right. And what they appeal to, what they say is that there are a lot of historical details in Acts that are correct. They say, for example, like Luke talks about the proconsul of some place, and they say it was difficult to get that right, according to you have to know.
Right.
And
which isn't true, actually. That's actually the easiest thing to get right. Because those were like routinely stored, easily accessible information in public libraries, and public libraries were everywhere. And so anybody could walk in there and look that stuff up. And if you're writing, then you obviously can read. So yeah, that would have been the easy thing to get right. It's like, well, who was in charge at that time? I need to get this little color detail in there. Although I suspect that, so what we know for the Judean area, all of it comes from Josephus. So Luke didn't have to look up any like lists or anything. He was just getting all his data from Josephus. He was using Josephus as his history reference book. So like who was in charge here, who would have been here, etc. He's just pulling it and pulling stories out of Josephus too, like how Herod died and what sort of romantic shenanigans were going on in the elite. And he's grabbing all that stuff from Josephus because we can see it all, because we have Josephus. So we can see he's just pulling it from that source. And then there's a second part of Acts, a different part of Acts, where it's taking place in the Aegean, right? So we've got in the area of what is now Turkey and Greece. Stuff goes on there. Now, obviously, they couldn't have used Josephus for that because he's writing about Judean history. He's not writing about Aegean history. But since we have Josephus and can see how Luke used Josephus to build out his Judean history part, we can certainly easily suspect that he was using another historian, a historian of the Aegean, which we know there were several of them, writing the histories of that particular region. There was a lot of those. None of them survived, but there were a lot of them we know that people refer to them. So he's probably using a historian for that period. And I'll bet that if we had that historian, and we could theoretically get that historian, if there's a library still buried in Herculaneum, Italy, that could have recent histories of the Aegean in it. And it could be one of the ones that the author of Luke used later. Can't be sure of this, but it's possible. Like, it's still there. It could do it. And let's say we did, and we found it, and we read it, and we go, oh, look, this is all the details that Luke uses to color his Aegean story come from this author, right? Just like with Josephus, right? And we could even expect maybe he made a few mistakes in his use of that historian too. So that would be entirely plausible. But even if he didn't have a specific historian for that, he can get all those details because of the kinds of things that they had constant like reference books and libraries for that stuff. Just like today, like you want to know who was the governor, of Texas in 1800 and whenever, right? There's a place you can go and easily look that up, right? And that was it was the same in the Roman Empire, that they had these kind of reference volumes for who was in charge, where, when, and so you can get that kind of data. Same with like there's a lot of books then about what are called peripli, which are basically kind of like tour guides, like travel guides. Like if you're taking a ship journey, you would get one of these peripli, and it would tell you like what's it like in each city as you go along a particular route, and it would have color details like we find in Acts regarding Ephesus about what are those people like, what are they obsessed with. The silversmiths of Ephesus is like a big deal that would be mentioned in one of these things, and so like these kinds of books would be readily available that the author of Luke could get to and get a lot of his color detail out of, even if he had to consult a bunch of them rather than just one. And so that's so easily done that is not hard to explain at all. And the key thing here is all of these details that corroborate in Luke are all these kinds of things. They're like incidental things that have nothing to do with Christianity. Like that there were famous silversmiths in Ephesus has nothing to do with Christianity. Who was governing Achaia at a particular time has nothing to do with Christianity. These are like isolated color details, are not core to the story. Whereas all of the details that are core to the story, like specific Christian actors doing specific things, we have no corroboration for any of that, right? So like the only things we can corroborate are things that don't connect to Christian history, that the author is seeding his text with to make it look authentic, to make it look believable or sound right or whatever. And so that's kind of a dead clue that this is fiction. And you can see this with any kind of fiction today, where they're setting some sort of fictional event inside history. So like you might have like some sort of time travel action adventure surrounding JFK, right? And all of the details of who was president of what, who was the governor of what, who was the head of the Secret Service. You could have like any of the names could be correct, but it's totally fiction because anybody can go and check the reference books and get all that color detail, get the history background right to make your story seem believable and realistic. But everybody knows it is fiction because all of the central things are all made up. They're just using history as a sort of backdrop for the fiction. And we know that happens all the time. So like it's constant in fiction today. It would have been common in fiction back then. So yeah, that argument doesn't work actually. And it certainly doesn't work against all that other evidence that we just stacked up, which is actually much more direct evidence of the fictionalization and mythologization that's going on in Acts.
Yes. So speaking of Luke using Josephus, I think there is a great book about that, about how we can see that Acts takes elements from Josephus, right? So I don't know, could we maybe go a bit deeper on that? Where do scholars stand of this, or what are some good examples of Luke taking stuff from Josephus?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the census is an obvious one. All the details of the census, every time that Luke mentions, so in the census, he mentions a bunch of magistrates and people who were ruling at the time, gets that from Josephus. There's a lot of, anytime he's talking about any named actual historical person or thing or event in Judea, the death of Herod, for example, all of that stuff he gets from Josephus. And there are books, like there's scholars who've cataloged these. There's like a lot of them, right? There's also a lot of similarity in language, a similarity in apologetical mission and style. So like Josephus is trying to do the same sort of thing that Acts is doing. So Acts is usually borrowing the sort of approach that Josephus. So it's also like lifting vocabulary, lifting the names of particular people, the sort of social politics, political events and things that matter. So he's getting a lot of material, and there are whole lists of these that people can go to. I start the breadcrumb in the article that we referenced at the top for people who want to go in and find all of the examples. There's a lot of them. But yeah, again, that's only for the Judean stuff. For the Aegean stuff, almost certainly Luke was using somebody else who we don't have.
Yeah. I think I recently saw a video that showed one cool example of this, and it was the power of the Egyptian and the Sicari and the 4,000 or 400. And what was cool about it is like he shows why Luke took took the elements that they were in Josephus, but he mixed them in a way that don't make sense or that is wrong. Like he said, like the Egyptian led the 4,000 Sicari to the wilderness, right? But the Sicari were this kind of urban knife wielding assassins. So it's a weird thing. That's what he was saying.
And even getting the name Sicari, he's getting from Josephus for this particular group. And you could debate whether Luke is just being sloppy or whether he doesn't really care about being precise. Like maybe he's merging the Egyptian with the Sicari because that's the story he wants to tell. He doesn't care that doesn't make any sense, right? The Egyptian and the Sicari had nothing to do with each other. The Sicari were assassins in the city, right? That was their particular problem. Is they're the dagger men. That's what that means. And so they're stirring up trouble by assassinating people to try and manipulate politics in the city. The Egyptian was this sort of prophetic figure, this sort of messianic figure who gathered people from the villages and led them to the Mount of Olives, claiming that he was going to usher in the end times or whatever. And then the Romans went and wiped him out or wiped out the people. I think they lost track of where the Egyptian, like he ran away and they never found him again or whatever. But anyway, so like these are like what Acts has done is the author has sort of connected these two and made them the same. Made them like interacted, which is kind of like the thing that you would do in fiction, right? It's like make up this story that, oh, you know what? They just happen to be colluding with these other people. We're going to tell it that way. And so he's sort of selling this sort of conspiracy theory version of history that doesn't accurately reflect it, but he's getting the details from Josephus and he's just making his own version out of that. Yeah,
that's interesting. So another important element of Acts is the so-called we passages, which are parts where the author speaks as we, as if he was there. And you have some very interesting stuff in your article about it. You say it's kind of weird the way he uses it, just weird. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about this?
And in the article we mentioned, which is how we know Acts is a fake history, which you can find at my website for people who, it'll be in the description, I guess, but at richardcarrier.info, and you can search for it there. That I summarize that and I link to another article, which is about the we passages that goes into a lot more detail about it. So if you really want to get into that, there's some really interesting stuff actually about that that I find actually very edifying as a historian because it shows how clever the author is. Whereas the Christian apologists who are trying to make this into evidence of eyewitness testimony are completely missing all the brilliance of the author, right? Like everything that's genius about the structure of the story requires admitting that it's fictional because the genius involves the actual juxtaposition and creation of narrative relating to that. But so there's a lot, we could do a whole show just on that, honestly. But the overall gist, though, is that we have no examples of this sort of mysterious, unexplained shift from third person to second person plural in any history or biography or anything like that. We only have that or anything like that in fiction. In fact, it was a common trope. We find it in a lot of places in fiction. And it was actually particularly common with sea narratives, not all sea narratives, but that's where you would find it. And in fact, it was common in the sea narratives that we know the author of Acts is using to construct his stories as models for constructing his stories, which is the Odyssey and the Aeneid. It shows up in other places too. It also shows up in a text that Luke also takes material from, which is Jubilees, which is a Jewish apocryphal text. It's another fake history that it doesn't record anything real. I think the we are like angels telling a story, telling a historical story that they witnessed or whatever, which is not real. It didn't happen. But we can see that where Luke borrows material from, he uses structure from Jubilees, and this is in peer-reviewed scholarship. I cited in the article. You can go find it there. But there's scholars have pointed out that there's a Jubilee structure in Acts. And guess where that Jubilee structure is? It's exactly where the we narratives start. And in fact, the Jubilees narrative spans the two of there are basically three we narratives in Acts. There are basically three ship narratives towards the end of Acts. And the first two, the Jubilees emulations, spans both. And the sort of third one kind of like picks up the same theme and like develops it basically. And another thing is that there's a lot of little structure here to the Odyssey and the Aeneid that spans all three. And you get this kind of like 3-day, it's not 3 days, but it's this 3-sequence narrative that is kind of about the Christian mission. And there's a lot of clues in there that the we is sort of an artificial fictional device for the reader. In other words, the we means all us Christians. So that the reader is now part of us, part of the we who's going on this final journey. And it's a journey that has the sort of fall and rise that kind of emulates the death and resurrection. And there's a lot of clues about this being a death and resurrection narrative without a literal death and resurrection, except at in the middle, which has an actual the Eutychus death and resurrection narrative. So there's a lot of this. The structure here is really brilliant, really brilliantly crafted, and you won't get it unless you like admit that this is a constructed story. It's not historical, and it's the we element is a deliberate part of the fiction, and you can see that. I wanted to like show something because I think we have a little bit of time, but part of just one example. There's many, and you go to my article on the we passages, and I go all the way to the end. Even the concluding section has more like really good gems as to, oh my God, that's really in the text and so on, that I think is worth reading if people want to really get this. But I want to show this one example just because it's graphically telling. I think I can.
Yeah, maybe share screen.
Yeah. And so, yeah, if you look at this table, which is in my article on the we passages, and this comes from other scholars who've done this and seen this stuff. And you can see the Odyssey and Acts, and there's a lot of other parallels, a lot of vocabulary parallels, other narrative parallels, structural parallels, etc. But this is like this is the second we passage. It's just the middle of the 3 we passage, sequence of events, a sort of triptych of stories. And this is the part where we have a death and resurrection narrative where Paul resurrects Eutychus. And it emulates the resurrection of, well, not the resurrection, but the sort of the death and meeting of the soul of Elpenor, which is a very similar story. And there's a lot of parallels between those two stories besides the one on this table. But here I just want to show the sequence so that people can get an idea of how Luke is inventing this story based on the Elpenor story from Odysseus, or from the Odyssey, and then is improving it, making his story better because the guy gets to be resurrected at the end. So it has the happy ending instead of the sad ending. So it's making the Acts, the epic of Christianity, is more exciting and better than the Odyssey. The Odyssey is depressing. Christianity is hopeful because you've got this resurrection thing. And this resurrection narrative is right in the middle of the 3-part storyline of the we passages that is itself a death and resurrection narrative regarding Paul and the Christian mission. And so there's more evidence of that and so on. But just going down the list, you can see you have Odysseus and his crew are leaving Troy en route to Achaia. And that is exactly what's happening in Acts. Paul and his crew arrive at Troy en route from Achaia. So they're doing the opposite direction. It's the same exact route, but they're going the opposite direction. And then you have its narration in first person plural begins at this point in the Odyssey. And guess what? That's exactly what happens in Acts. The narration in the first person plural begins there. So we've got that already. We're seeing these close parallels in structure. And then after a journey that they make, they have a meal, and then in both stories. So that happens after they arrive. In both stories, they go off, do something, and then they have a meal. In both stories, there's a disaster comes at night. In both stories, there's something like this. So there's the crew sleeps in Circe's darkened halls. And in Acts, it mentions that there are plenty of lamps in the upper room. So it's obviously a dark room, but it needed lamps. So you have that sort of parallel. And then the narration switches to third person with the sentence, there was one Elpenor, the youngest. And this is in the Odyssey. Guess what happens in Acts? The narration switches to third person with a certain young man named Eutychus. And the same things are going to happen to these guys. So it's very clear, like this is a coincidence that's impossible unless the author of Acts is deliberately emulating the Elpenor narrative and wants his readers to get that because, in a sense, his story is a commentary on the Elpenor narrative through Eutychus. So anyway, so now we've got the narration switched back to third person with the exact same introduction of the exact same young man. Their names are different but similar. And then, by the way, Elpenor's name means hopeful, but he is declared in the story to be unlucky. And Eutychus's name is, guess what? Lucky. So he's the opposite. They're named the opposite. So Elpenor is hopeful, but he was unlucky. But Eutychus is lucky because that's his name. In both stories, the guy, Elpenor in one, Eutychus in the other, they fall into a deep sleep or a sweet sleep. And then they fall. Elpenor falls off the roof. Eutychus falls from a third-story window. And Elpenor's soul goes to Hades. Eutychus' soul stays in him. But then the associates fetch his dead body in both stories. And then only after, in the Elpenor story, they meet him in Hades, right? So they get to see him and talk to him again, but in Hades. In the Acts story, Paul declares that he isn't really dead, so he's not in Hades. And then in the Odyssey, Elpenor's body is buried at dawn. But in the Acts story, Eutychus comes back to life at dawn. And so you have all these markers are just impossible by coincidence. And so that's just, I wanted to show that because that's an example of what we're talking about. And there's many, 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 many more examples like this in the book of Acts. I talk about it in chapter 10 of my book on the historicity of Jesus, where I go through all the scholarship, tons of examples. There's more in my article. There's been more published since, and so on. So we have a lot of evidence of this. And that's just one piece of it, so you can see the kind of thing we're talking about.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. It was indeed a very interesting parallel. You can tell it's very impressive.
Yeah.
So how about the topic of dating? What can you tell us about the dating of Acts? When do you think Acts was written?
Yeah, I agree with most scholars now. The mainstream consensus now is that it's the early 2nd century, roughly around 115 plus minus 10 years, somewhere around there. We don't know the exact date, obviously, because it's not in the book. And the book is never mentioned until the late 2nd century, so we can't get it any more precise than that. The reason it's dated to around then now is mainly because it's using the Antiquities of Josephus, which published in 93. So we know it's after 93. But also it seems to be aware of the change in leadership from Domitian to Trajan, because the atmosphere of how Romans behaved towards Christians changed between Domitian and Trajan. And the author of Acts seems to be aware of that and is trying to play that up. He's acting on this to basically market it. He wants to push this narrative because it's good. And also the vocabulary is very similar to other things that were being forged around this time. So the pastoral letters have a very similar language to the book of Acts, and they have very similar concerns. So they appear to be written around the same time, and that we pretty much are sure that that's the early 2nd century. And there's other clues like that. So there's reasons that we suspect that it's actually written in the early 2nd century, not before that. The usual attempt to rebut that is to say that, but the book of Acts, they try to come up with a bunch of things like the book of Acts doesn't mention the Jewish war. Yeah, and then the other one is the fact that the book ends in the 60s, right? And it ends before telling the story of the death of Paul. However, there's a lot of reasons why that wouldn't be there. And I didn't know if you want to talk about that separately from the date, but that's part of why
that's fine,
mainstream scholars reject that. That's a bad argument. And they're more impressed by the other arguments that show that it's early 2nd century.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. Like when apologists sometimes say, okay, if it's late, how come it doesn't mention the death of Paul, right? That's a common argument.
Yeah. There's, one thing you have to realize is that it's possible he doesn't mention the death of Paul because he didn't know anything about it. We actually don't have any descriptions of what happened to Paul until way later, so late 2nd century. And then those are wild myths that we know aren't true. And so those myths might not have existed at the time that Acts was writing. So the author of Acts might not know. And I think a lot of what Acts is doing is using the dossier of Paul, the letters of Paul, to build out his fictional narrative. The letters of Paul obviously don't mention when he died, right? So if that's the only information the author of Acts had, plus maybe some other things that were, not related to the death of Paul, then that would be why he doesn't narrate the death of Paul, because he doesn't know anything about it, right? There's no reason to assume that he would know anything about it. But a better reason why he wouldn't do that is that the later legends portray Paul as being killed by the Romans. And this is implied also by First Clement, which was probably written in the 60s and probably had good information, is probably right about that. And if that's the case, then that goes against the entire agenda of Acts, right? So Luke, Acts, the two books together, are pushing this narrative that the Christians were always law-abiding and the Romans were always nice to them. And so that would just kill the whole narrative, right? So like that would destroy the entire agenda of the book to admit that the Roman authorities executed Paul. So the author of Acts can't tell that story. He has to pretend it doesn't exist and just end on the hopeful note that it's kind of the point of the mission, and then not do anything further with that. The other thing that's important to note is that First Clement says that Paul died in Spain. He didn't die in Rome, and Paul even says, like in his letters, that I'm going to go to Rome on my way to Spain. So we know Paul was going to Spain from himself. He himself tells us he was going to Spain through Rome. And when he was going to Rome, he wasn't going in chains. He was going there voluntarily. Like it was just his part of his mission. And he was going to go on to Spain. So like the story in Acts contradicts the eyewitness of Paul entirely. But the author of Acts obviously knows the story. So he knows that Paul was going to Spain. He doesn't have any evidence that he died in Rome. First Clement doesn't say he died in Rome. This is an important thing. It says he died in the furthest west, which was at that time understood to be Spain usually. But we don't have any stories. The legends don't describe any death in Spain. They talk about a completely mythical, unbelievable story of him dying in Rome, which doesn't make any sense. And so basically, according to Acts, or the author of Acts, so far as he knows, Paul went on to Spain and died there, because if he's reading First Clement, he would know he died in Spain, but we don't know any details about it, so I can't tell that narrative, and I don't even want to mention it because it says that he was killed by the authorities, and that's bad. That contradicts my narrative. So I think that's kind of the reason why the book ends where it does, and doesn't narrate the death of Paul. And so that's, I think, sufficient to explain that. And that gets away from that argument that he ended before then. There's other arguments you could point out, like there's no reason that the author of Acts would publish his book before the conclusion of Paul's trial, right? Like why would he, rush to publication? It's not even resolved yet whether he's going to live or die. So that doesn't make any sense. And then also the author of Acts knows Paul's died, right? So in passage Acts 20:25, the author of Acts has Paul tell the Ephesians, you will never see me again. So obviously saying I'm not coming back because I'm going to die, right? So the author of Acts knows Paul is dead. So he consciously chose not to narrate the death or describe the death of Paul. And so it wasn't because he wrote before the death of Paul. It wouldn't make any sense for him to write before the death of Paul anyway, but also because we know for a fact the author of Acts wrote after he died. So his removal of that story is a deliberate choice. It wasn't something that we can date the text by.
Okay, that was great. Thank you. So yeah, there is another topic that is frequent in Acts, and it's the issue of persecution. And persecution is a common thing that apologists bring up. The normal argument is, okay, the disciples were in line because they were willing to risk all this death and persecution over that. And one of the main things supporting that is Acts, right? And there are some skeptics like Candida Moss, for example. She has made a great case saying that the persecution thing in Acts has been a bit exaggerated. I mean, they agree that there was some persecution going on with the early Christians. They do grant that, but they think Acts really exaggerates the degree of this problem, persecution. What do you think?
Yeah, it's absolutely true that it exaggerates. For one thing, we don't have any evidence of anybody being killed at all until First Clement, and that's later. That's like after the end of Paul's letters, right? There's actually some suspicious things about the circumstances. First Clement implies that Christians got Peter and Paul killed. There was some sort of rivalry and trumped up charges, so they were killed for some other crime that they were framed for that has nothing to do with their religion. I have an article on that. There are other scholars who pointed this out, that the way that First Clement narrates the stories is not in line with the Acts narrative of what happened. And even that's later, right? And so one thing we get from the letters of Paul is that across the entire career of the entire 50s of all his letters, the Jerusalem the Jerusalem leaders of the church never left. The Jerusalem were always preaching openly in Jerusalem from the beginning to the end of Paul's career. And Acts depicts them as having to flee Jerusalem because of the persecution. Well, we know that's false, right? So, from Paul himself, an eyewitness, no, they were never forced to flee. And in fact, the only opposition they faced in Jerusalem was from fellow Christians. So there were the Christians who insisted that you could only be Christian if you were Jewish. So you had to get circumcised. You had to follow the dietary laws and so on. And Paul was against that. He was saying like, well, no, we can bring Gentiles in without converting them to Judaism. He eventually convinced the leaders of the church, James, John, and Peter, to go along with that. He had to persuade them, though. So the book of Acts has Peter have a revelation before all this where he's already on board with the Gentile mission. That's not what happened. Paul says that Peter was not on board with the Gentile mission. Paul had to convince him. And so it wasn't a revelation that did it. And so anyway, he does that. But then he mentions that there are some fellow Christians who are not having it. And so that they're trying to, interfere, to basically create drama, accusations, and things like that, trying to make it difficult. And Paul lambasts them for this. So this was an inner church debate. There was no persecution from the Jews on them. And if there was, it was not really significant enough to get them out of the city, right? They stayed there the whole time. Paul himself talks about being beaten by both Gentiles and Jewish authorities. And for whatever, he doesn't mention what crimes they were. And that's possible. So that's more believable in terms of, but that's not something that's going to chase you out of town, right? Because whatever your offense was, whether it was a trumped up charge or something that was you're harassing somebody and you got beaten up for it or whatever, but that's the kind of thing that is plausible. But the sort of grandiose narratives in Acts aren't. And there's really there's the main death narrative is sort of the traditional martyrdom narrative, which is Stephen, right? But the Stephen narrative is totally fictional. I mean, even his name is fake. So although Stephen was a real Greek name, incidentally, Greek name, not a Jewish name, which raises questions. It's why has this guy got a Greek name in the middle of Jerusalem? But of course, Stephen means crown, and crown was the metaphor for salvation. So for martyrs, right? So a martyr would receive the crown, right? And so here's a martyr named Crown. That's a dead giveaway of fiction. And then the whole story, it doesn't make any sense. The speech Stephen gives is completely anachronistic, is not at all the speech he would give in that particular circumstance. It's all based on the Septuagint, not on the Old Testament, in the Hebrew or Aramaic tradition. He's there's no formal trial. He's just murdered without a conviction or a proper trial procedure. None of that would happen, right? And then Paul is there to watch it, which we know from Paul himself he could not have been, because he wasn't there. And Paul never mentions anybody being killed. He never mentions himself killing anybody or anybody else being killed. When he says persecute, he's talking about, it's actually, the word is pursue, which can mean harass, right? So it doesn't even mean any legal action. It could just mean that he yelled at preachers and tried to hecklers veto them or whatever, or tried to argue with them or tried to get trumped up charges against them or whatever. Harass can be anything. So it's very nonspecific as to what Paul did when he was a persecutor himself. And it's unclear what other persecutors did, other than from what Paul says, that he got beaten a lot, but not executed, right? So he's beaten and let go, right? So that tells you that they're not doing anything that was a death penalty offense, right? Because he was able to get through these criminal actions very easily all the time. So anyway, that's the exaggeration that we get in the book of Acts, where it's really trumping up this martyrdom narrative. And yeah, Candida Moss is one of several scholars who've pointed this out, not just for Acts, but for all the legends after as well.
Yeah, okay. I wanted to talk about this one last story of Acts. Is the story where when Peter gets, at the beginning of Acts, I think Peter gets thrown in prison. And the story says that Herod had 16 soldiers watching Peter, right? That's really a lot. So, I mean, somebody could say, okay, maybe he was expecting a bunch of Christians to try to rescue him or something. Well, I could say maybe that's what happens, right? And then the Act says that an angel came from the sky and made the soldiers fall asleep and release Peter, right?
Yeah.
And what I think to myself is, don't you think that the the argument from silence in this particular case is kind of strong, because you think if Herod put so many soldiers taking care of Peter, it means Peter was a high profile case. It will make the whole thing a high profile. I don't think Herod will throw 16 soldiers to go out and just some guy, right? It would have been a high profile thing. I mean, Josephus would have written about it. Somebody would have written about it. So
it's even more ridiculous. So one of the things that happens in Acts is that Peter and Paul do all the same things. Like, so each one fights a wizard, each one does this, each one does that. But Paul always does it bigger. Also, there's parallels between Paul and Jesus, and Paul always does it bigger. Right, so like Jesus crosses the Sea of Galilee, well, Paul crosses the Aegean, which is a way bigger sea. Paul is Jesus has marched from Galilee to Jerusalem. Paul marches across the whole Eastern world at the time, right? So, but there's also this parallelism between Peter and Paul is always better than Peter. He always does something bigger than Peter, and so like when you get to the soldiers, yeah, you got the 4 squads of 4, right? That's in I think Acts 12. But when you get later, like Acts 26 or something like that, 25, 26, you have the entire cohort, 600 soldiers are guarding Paul, which is absurd. So yeah, like that would be a massive international incident. Like, why would there be an entire cohort guarding this guy from imminent assassination? And there's like correspondence between, the Roman leaders of wreaking their hands over this. Yeah, that would be a massive incident that could hardly not have been recorded, right? No, these are obvious fabrications, right? These are exaggerations of try to make them seem more important than they are, which they're not. The Peter stories, they're actually like there's the breakout stories, the jailbreak stories, are actually based on other jailbreak stories that we have from the Bacchae of Euripides, for example. And so there's other parallels in other literature that Luke is borrowing from to build these stories. But that element, yeah, the ridiculous amount of guards is completely implausible.
Yeah, I think I think we can wrap it up. So maybe if you have some final thoughts on it, or you can tell the audience where can they find like more information or something like that,
Yeah, so obviously start with the article, because all the breadcrumbs are there. So like there's a lot more material in my book on the historicity of Jesus. Obviously, there's other scholars' books and articles. I've got other articles that deep dive other aspects of it. But all of that is in the main article. So that's how we know Acts is a fake history. So you can go to richardcarrier.info. That's .info. At my website, and you can search for that and you'll find it. And so you can find all the links there and all the references to books and all of that stuff too. I think the only thing that's not in there is that I do an update in Obsolete Paradigm of a Historical Jesus, which is my new book that just came out, where I have a small section on what's happened with regard to Acts scholarship since I published in 2014. And a lot of it's gone in the direction that we've been talking about today. The mainstream consensus is more and more on board with this Acts as fiction narrative. A lot of really good books and scholarship has been published on this. And I have a huge footnote with bibliography of all the new stuff, the great stuff to look at in Obsolete Paradigm. So if people want to like catch up to the narrative, that's a good place to get to as well. That book's worth, has a lot of other useful things in it too, that you can find if you're interested in these subjects, because it ranges across a lot of other topics. But yeah, that's where I've gathered all of the information about this to sort of like get you started in your adventure exploring the scholarship of Acts. And I think like if you start with my articles on my blog, you'll get a feel for how the literary structure, literary analysis of Acts is way more rewarding than the apologetical treatment of Acts, because they just need it to be historically true. And so they're just ignoring all the brilliant artistry and the messaging of the author. And so if you're just willing to admit that Acts is mythology, then you can actually deep dive as to, well, what is the author doing? What is the message here? How is he constructing these stories? There's a lot of really intricate, brilliant structure and emulation and literary style and things like that going on in the Book of Acts that will make you appreciate the book more as a book, rather than just trying to get it to be history, which it's not.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. So guys, go check that out. That was all for today. So Thank you for watching. Thank you, Dr. Kerry, also for coming to the channel. It's always great to have you.
Yeah. You always ask really great questions, so I'm always keen to see what you got next. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so see you guys next time. Please subscribe to the channel. Bye.